Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is ZW Buckley. Now, if you haven't noticed, my videos have bumpers. And on my recent video about orchestration in Ableton Live, I received this comment from user Despair Quietly, Please, asking about the sound I use for those bumpers. Hi, the incidental score stab sounds / pads at the beginning are great. Microtonal like Micah Levi's score for Zone of Interest. Where did you get them from? Well, I didn't get them from anywhere. I made them myself using Ableton Live's Drift. And I mentioned as much in my follow-up comment, which in response, Despair Quietly Please said, please do a video exploring the creation of that patch in Drift, ZW Buckley. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today. So I'm going to show you exactly how to build this patch today and some additional processing that you can do to make it your own. Let's jump right in. So here's the sound that I'm going to be breaking down for you today. And as we can hear, despite the fact that it's just a single pad playing one chord the whole time, there is so much harmonic movement, as if little melodies and notes are coming in and out. And I'm doing this all through detuning. Now, I think detuning is an immensely underrated part of synthesis. It allows you to find little hidden musical spaces and interesting moments of tension and release between the notes on the keyboard. And pretty much all of Ableton's stock synths can do some really interesting detuning, but I actually think that there is no better synth equipped for that than Drift. And I say that specifically because of Drift's namesake, Drift Control. What this does is it introduces randomization to each voice. It will introduce randomization in pitch or detune the voice, as well as introduce randomization in the filter position for each voice. And so when you start to crank up this Drift Control, you go from a very static sound to a very lively sound. And what we're going to do is we're going to build out this sound in a way that supports what's happening with the Drift Control and takes advantage of Drift's honestly excellent LFO to be able to support that sound. So we're actually going to start off by using two oscillator shapes that are entirely unique to Drift. So for oscillator 1, we are going to select our shark tooth waveform here. We're going to leave the octave at 0, and we're going to set the shape to 0.5 or halfway on the dial. For the modulation, we're going to go ahead and set the source to the LFO, and we're going to crank it up 100%. Let's go ahead and turn off oscillator 2, and let's listen to that now. We're also going to crank the mix up to 0 decibels, as that is going to trigger the highest stage of saturation for the filter. Let's listen. So we already hear all of that movement happening, and we can see it in the waveform display down here as well. Let's disengage oscillator 1 for now and go to oscillator 2. So we're going to set the wave shape to the saturated wave shape. We're going to set the octave to 0. We're going to set the detune to 0.19. So it's still going to be the same note as coming in, but it is going to have a lot of tension when played against oscillator 1. Now we're also going to set the level for this to 0 as well. And because we have added 6 decibels of gain to each oscillator, I'm just going to go ahead and drop our output volume to -15 just to be safe. So let's listen to oscillator 2. A pretty simple sound. Let's add back in oscillator 1. So already a lot of tension, a lot of movement being caused, frankly, just by having the two oscillators detuned from one another. Now, to wrap up the oscillator section, we're going to add just a little bit of noise. We're going to set it to negative 41 decibels. And for the pitch modulation, we are just going to add 1% to the LFO. That sounds pretty extreme at this point, but we will take some measures to tame it. And with that, we have wrapped up the oscillator section. So we're going to go ahead and leave our filter type at type 1. We're also going to leave key tracking to 0. We're going to make the filter just affect the entire frequency spectrum regardless of what notes are coming in. We're going to set the filter cutoff to 1000 hertz. We're going to set the high pass to 270 hertz. And we're going to set the resonance to 0.38. With just those adjustments, it now sounds like this. So as we can hear, we've really reduced the frequency spectrum. We're going to use modulation to reintroduce the rest of the frequency spectrum. And the first way that we're going to do that is heading down to our frequency modulation source. For our first modulation source, we're going to select the LFO and we're going to set it to 100%. And we're going to just leave the second modulation source at 0. And now with the filter cutoff being modulated by the LFO, it sounds like this. So as you can hear, we are currently sweeping, but that sweeping is still just set to the default sine wave that the LFO is set at. So we're going to get there. But for now, we will move on from the filter section. So for our envelopes, we're going to leave envelope 2 as is. We don't need it for this patch. Instead, we're going to focus on envelope 1. Now, because this is a pad, we're going to go for a longer attack time. So I'm going to set the attack to 950 milliseconds. The 600 milliseconds for decay is fine. And we're going to leave the sustain and the release where it is at as well. The envelopes are pretty simple for this one. This isn't the primary focus of this patch, so we can move on. So really quick, I just wanted to pause and mention that if you are enjoying the workflow of this video, in which I am walking you through the construction of a synth patch while explaining the how and why behind the choices we're making, and you happen to be a bit newer to synthesis, or maybe just not super confident in your grasp of synthesis, you should check out my course, Beginner Synthesis in Ableton Live. It is filled with videos exactly like this, in which I walk you through the construction of so many different synth patches and teach you why the design choices we choose in those videos works. So if you are ready to unblock synthesis and finally become comfortable with the fundamentals, head to the link in the description or click this card above me to learn more about beginner synthesis in Ableton Live. Let's jump back in. Now let's actually focus on making some adjustments to the LFO to dial in a more precise sound. So here's where everything is with the LFO in its default setting. So we can see it's a really consistent, constant sweep, and we don't want it to be so predictable. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to leave the rate exactly as it is and move downwards to the wave shape. And we're going to select Wander, which is my favorite waveform to use for the LFO, as instead of a sample and hold, which just periodically changes to a different position instantly, Wander gradually moves between those random positions. Let me hit play so we can hear that. So we can hear it moving randomly between different values at the rate that we set. Now it's still really broadly sweeping between things, so the last thing that we're going to do for the LFO is down under amount. We're just going to set the amount to 50%. And this becomes a parameter which you can then assign to a macro to change up the intensity of the LFO. But with it dropped to 50% now, it sounds like this. Now we've just got a few more adjustments to make, and we're going to be in the home stretch. So let's tab over to the modulation matrix. And what we want to do here is for our first routing, instead of the mod wheel, we are going to go ahead and select the LFO. And we're going to route it to control the high pass frequency. Now we're going to set our value to -100%, which means that it is going to sweep this high pass down. So now what we have is our low pass and our high pass moving in opposition of one another, expanding to the full frequency spectrum and then truncating to smaller values. And that adds a lot of the rich and interesting movement that we're looking for in this patch. And that sounds like this. And then for our mode, we're going to select stereo, and we're going to bring it up to 50%, which just applies panning to the voices, which widens the stereo image. That sounds like this. And then finally, the drift control. We're going to bring that up to 75%, and that's going to introduce that per voice randomization with regards to pitch and filter that finally brings this patch to life. Now the final details that we want for this patch is to introduce a little bit of additional processing via effects. So I'm going to grab an instance of hybrid reverb, which is one of my favorite devices in all of Live. And with hybrid reverb, our patch now sounds like this. The final effect that I'm going to grab is an instance of overdrive. And this might surprise you, but I love running dynamics processing or distortion after reverb, because now we can then add rich, interesting overtones to the reverb as well as just the dry signal and add some of that richness. So let's go ahead and bring the wet dry down to 0 and slowly add this in, and then we'll shape the controls as we're going. As you can hear, there's so much beauty in everything that was just played there. And if I crank the reverb all the way, it's still just as rich and interesting. It's mellower, but still full of interesting harmonics. So the final step really is to choose your favorite reverb and your favorite distortion or saturation plugin and run it after this patch to add the final bits of body necessary to fill it out. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to save this patch to your library. And as I mentioned, if you like this approach to learning synthesis, check out my course, Beginner Synthesis in Ableton Live. It is filled to the brim with videos exactly like this. The course takes about 6 hours to go through, but the impact will be lifetime. As always, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Till next time.